Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's rank every Nintendo console. Worst to best, obviously. Here is the criteria. Number 1, hardware quality at release. Number 2, game catalog while the console was relevant. Number 3, how 1 and 2 have held up over time. Let's start with the worst. Number 13, the Virtual Boy from 1995. Contrary to popular belief, this was not Nintendo's first 3D console. It was a glorified tech demo rushed to market because of fears of Nintendo's competitors, namely Sega and Sony, famous for inducing headaches and requiring an awkward position to even play. The Virtual Boy was very red. There are almost no games for the Virtual Boy either. Those that exist are very much like the console itself, tech demos. There is apparently a good Wario game stranded on the ancient hardware that has never been ported, but the whole thing is generally for collectors only. It sold 770,000 units, which is actually the worst-selling Nintendo console of all time. Number 12 is the Nintendo 64 from 1996. This will be a controversial pick for people of a certain age, but the Nintendo 64 was a big miss. It had capable hardware in some ways, but it was crippled by Nintendo's decision to use cartridges rather than comparatively massive and cheap CDs. Cartridges cut down on loading times and impeded piracy, but it's hard to underestimate what a bad decision this was. Entire genres like the JRPG disappeared from Nintendo platforms. Third-party developers were unwilling to port software because of space limitations. The N64 was also part of the worst generation of consoles, the first ones to push heavily into 3D. It was hot at the time, but even one generation later the games looked like choppy eyesores. You went from bright, crisp 60 FPS 2D games to 15 FPS fog with blurry textures. Not pretty. The N64 was also plagued by a dearth of software. If it weren't for a few great first and second party titles, the platform would be as forgettable as the 3DO. It's a small library, and it hasn't held up well at all. The controller was also very strange and remains unreliable. The N64 did one thing very well, though: multiplayer. Chances are, if you were a kid in the 90s, you have some fond memories of gaming with your friends, and that probably involved Nintendo. The games that facilitated this, like GoldenEye, don't always hold up well, though. Nintendo shipped approximately 33 million of these consoles, making it a moderate success, but it was a significant step back from the sales of both the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, which preceded it. Number 11 is the Game Boy Color from 1998. Technically a follow-up console to the Game Boy, it ends up feeling like a side grade. The screen was very hard to see. Adding color mode to older titles didn't look particularly good, but it had a great form factor and battery life and full backward compatibility. What makes the Game Boy Color mediocre is its software library. It's absolutely packed with garbage shovelware and terrible licensed games marketed towards young children. DX versions of previous Game Boy titles do not save it. It's not even the best hardware to play its own games on. Number 10, the Wii from 2006. People either love or hate the Wii, with few in the middle. Nintendo sold 100 million of these, and in many cases to people who weren't serious gamers. It's not uncommon to see Wiis in retirement homes even now. Its big gimmick is also its biggest failure: motion controls. The fact is that motion controls just don't work. They were imprecise and unreliable, often a frustration rather than an innovation. However, when they were used well, they could be quite fun. Part of the problem is trying to paste motion controls into standard game design. The other problem was the anemic graphics. It was the only SD console of its generation, and while graphics aren't everything, the games don't look good on modern displays. This was also a problem for third-party software. The Wii had terrible ports. The Wii had a few good things going for it, though, including full GameCube compatibility and some very good first-party software. It had the Virtual Console, which further expanded its library. It also had a unique shop in WiiWare, innovative indie titles. The Wii, because of its popularity, had a big shovelware problem. A large proportion of the games released are awful. I still see Wii games on clearance at Walgreens. Accessing the library is mostly about sticking to first-party titles and finding hidden gems. Number 9, Game Boy Advance from 2001. I have a lot of affection for this hardware, and it was very good at the time, with some exceptions. The first version of the console had terrible screen visibility, only playable in the bathroom or with light accessories. It had full backward compatibility with Game Boy Color and Game Boy games, which made it an easy sell for people who already had a handheld software library. The graphics were generally very impressive for handhelds at the time, if you could see them. The SP variant of the Game Boy Advance solved the visibility problems. The problem with the Game Boy Advance is, like others, the software library. It's not particularly bad, but it's not great either. A big portion of titles are ports from previous console generations, which are mostly superfluous for a modern gamer, though they were rather novel at the time. It remains a great platform for classic JRPGs, containing ports of Final Fantasy games and original titles like Golden Sun and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. A few of these are still not available on newer platforms. It also has some of the best Castlevania games. Even though the hardware was only current for approximately 3 years before the release of the Nintendo DS, it still managed to sell a whopping 81 million units, making it a runaway commercial success. Number 8. The Game Boy. The legend that brought handheld gaming to the masses. It was clunky and had a blurry green dot matrix screen. Its graphics were worse than Sega and Atari, who had full-color screens on their handhelds, but it won for 2 reasons. The price, $99, and games. Also, battery life. It's surprising how well the game library has held up after 30 years and considering how simple the hardware was. Many original Game Boy games are still worth playing and are seeing new releases today. Proof that good software is about good design, not graphics. It was the first console to have Pokémon, around the time of the Game Boy Pocket, which was a big improvement over the original hardware in size and screen and battery life. It also had an innovative suite of features and add-ons, including networking, a digital camera, and a printer. Combined with the Game Boy Color, it sold approximately 118 million units, making it one of the most successful game platforms of all time. But would you know that it's only Nintendo's 3rd best-selling platform? Number 7, the GameCube from 2001. This time only slightly crippled by media choice. It used mini DVDs instead of full-size. The colorful box started the meme belief that Nintendo is for kids, despite having a wealth of software for adults. GameCube spent its generation stuck in the middle. More powerful than PlayStation 2, but less than Xbox. GameCube has a strong software library that's worth playing today. It had the inverse of the N64 problem. It was part of the best generation of 3D games before design shifted towards cinematic presentations. Amazing first-party titles added to this. The Nintendo GameCube also had a very interesting feature, connectivity with the Game Boy Advance, allowing some very novel 4-player co-op experiences. What held the GameCube back was ultimately the PlayStation 2, the best-selling console of all time. It had a bigger and really better library, came out over a year earlier, and it played DVDs when people still hadn't bought DVD players. Sales of the GameCube were even worse than the Nintendo 64, and it only shipped around 22 million units. Number 6, the Nintendo DS. The DS is Nintendo's best-selling platform ever, and the 2nd best-selling platform of all time, with 154 million units shipped. Yet few gamers would say it's their favorite console. It was still a solid console with an innovative design and a huge, mostly now forgotten, library. In Nintendo fashion, it was backward compatible with the Game Boy Advance, but not earlier Game Boy games. It featured 2 screens, one of which was a touchscreen, and had both good battery life and good durability. My white DS Lite still works. With a clamshell design, it was the easiest handheld yet to carry in a pocket. But its biggest innovation, the touchscreen, was also its weakest feature, as Nintendo forced first-party games to adopt its use when it was unnecessary. Using a stylus was awkward with one hand and hurt the experience of otherwise straightforward games like Phantom Hourglass and Star Fox. But the touchscreen was also influential, as were the chat functions. Many of the control schemes developed on the DS would find their way to smartphones, help making them the portable gaming device of choice for a decade. Case in point, the casual game Cooking Mama, and there are still lots of gems in the catalog. Number 5 is the Wii U from 2012, the 2nd worst-selling Nintendo console with only 13.5 million units shipped. It was in reality one of their best-designed products, but it hit the market at a strange time and was given a name that made casuals think it wasn't a new console at all. It had a large controller, comfortable for little hands, with a built-in second screen that could be used for remote play, a very useful feature in 2012 if you had a family, and it had full backward compatibility with the Wii and its controllers. It has a small but unique library of games, with many still unported in newer systems. The first-party games were excellent, and were in part the reason for the successful launch of the Nintendo Switch, as Nintendo could port them over easily. Most Switch system sellers were actually Wii U games. The Wii U remains very hackable and is one of the best emulation and virtual console systems around. It's still the best way to play Wii games on an HD display, as well as GameCube ROMs through its built-in Wii emulator. 10 years later, it still gets more playtime than my Switch. Number 4, the 3DS from 2011. Another innovative piece of Nintendo hardware that didn't fully catch on, at least initially. The 3DS, like the Wii U, looks like an upgrade of a previous console, but is something more. It has a full 3D screen with no glasses required. Unfortunately, the console was expensive on release, and some people didn't like the 3D effect, which was improved with the revised new Nintendo 3DS. It also, like the PS Vita, launched at the height of smartphone adoption, and sales were weak early on, though they would grow to be more than 75 million total units across all the different variants of the 3DS, including the 2DS. It had full DS backward compatibility and many virtual console games. Like the Wii U, it's easily hackable and uses simple microSD cards for storage, making it a great option for emulation. It even takes 3D photos and does augmented reality. Due to its unique hardware, its game catalog is difficult to port, and many of the best games of certain franchises, like Fire Emblem, remain locked to the 3DS hardware. There are also lots of 3D remakes of classic games. Overall, it's a great console and the last of the true pocket portable systems. A great way to play Dragon Quest, every game to date technically, Zelda, Fire Emblem, etc., though the eShop closes soon and hacking will be the only way after that time to access certain titles. Number 3 is the Famicom, or the Nintendo Entertainment System, from way back in 1983. The NES, as it's often called, saved the video game console industry, and it did so by providing a high-quality game library and initially marketing itself in the West as an entertainment system after the 1980s game crash. It made Nintendo synonymous with game console, so in 1990 you would hear things like, "I bought him a Genesis Nintendo." It was ubiquitous, and its presence in living rooms created the strongest seed of gamer culture. Everyone knows the NES. The NES is also famous for its many accessories. It came packed in with a light gun, but had a disk drive in Japan, a robot, and a slew of odd controllers like the Power Glove. It was also Nintendo's first 3D console, using shutter glasses. The library is packed with classics, but because of the influence of the arcade market, many of these were tough as nails, so later kids would call challenging games Nintendo hard. Before there was Dark Souls, there was Ninja Gaiden and Contra. The only reason this console is not number 1 is that though the catalog was good, it doesn't hold up as well as other systems. There are plenty of stinkers on the system, and whole YouTube channels are dedicated to them. The system was a huge commercial success, selling around 62 million units, but even with a high number like that, it falls well short of describing just how influential the NES and its game library was for the gaming industry and for the culture at large. Truly, it's one of the most important computers ever made. Number 2, the Super Nintendo, otherwise known as the Super Famicom. The SNES was Nintendo's 16-bit entry into the market, competing with the Sega Genesis, and it, along with the Sega, represented the height of 2D gaming in aesthetics and gameplay. The SNES has one of the best game catalogs of all time, so full of classics it would be staggering to list them all, constant fodder for re-releases on modern consoles. Best of lists of franchises invariably include a Super Famicom release. The gameplay and aesthetics of the 16-bit era has held up better than any other, with almost the entire catalog just as fun and pleasing to the eye, at least with the CRT, as it was back in the 1990s. It was another commercial success for Nintendo, selling just shy of 50 million units, but it still wasn't the best. Number 1 is the Nintendo Switch from 2017. Truthfully, I don't like putting the Switch at number 1 because it isn't my favorite, but all things considered, it's the champ. With 125 million units shipped and counting, it's hard to argue against it. It brought Nintendo back, and brought handhelds back too. The Switch, in contrast to Nintendo's high-concept innovation of previous gens, was a simple idea executed well on affordable, plentiful hardware. The idea was a system that could be portable and yet be a home console. That alone outshone all the other gimmicks, like the Joy-Cons. It was not the first console to do this. Sega did it in the 90s with the Nomad, but Nintendo was able to release the Switch at a time when their own handheld was aging, the 3DS, and there was interest in games outside of phones, a desire for better mobile gaming. It wasn't excellent as a home console, and it was too large to carry in a pocket, and the Joy-Cons weren't particularly reliable. But the options made it attractive to all gamers, and it wasn't marketed as a handheld, but as a full console with AAA games. What really sells the Switch, besides its options, is the massive game library, including classics from every generation to date. It turns out great games matter a lot more than resolutions and textures. They even matter more than stick drift. So, in the end, if you can only own one, the Switch is the best choice. It gives you the best of from previous gens, as well as playable versions of most modern third-party games, plus access to Nintendo's first-party software. But why would you own just one? So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below, and I'll see you all next time.